In 2016, a father and son vanished without a trace in Yellowstone National Park, and 7 years later, rangers discovered them alive in a place that shouldn't exist. Sarah Henderson remembers every detail of that morning with painful clarity. The smell of coffee brewing in their cabin rental, the way sunlight filtered through the pine trees outside their window, the excited chatter of her children as they packed sandwiches and water bottles for what was supposed to be a simple day hike. She remembers thinking, as families often do on vacation, that this would be a memory they'd look back on fondly for years to come. She had no idea it would become the dividing line of her entire life, everything before that day and everything after. It was August 14th, 2016. The Henderson family had driven from their home in Seattle to Yellowstone for their annual summer vacation. David, 42 years old, was a civil engineer with a methodical mind and a passion for the outdoors. Sarah, 39, taught elementary school and had always been the family's emotional anchor. Their daughter Emma was 12, already showing signs of her mother's empathy and kindness. And Jacob, their 8-year-old son, was his father's shadow, curious about everything, always asking how things worked, why birds flew in certain patterns, what made rivers carve through stone. The family had been coming to Yellowstone for 5 years running. They knew the major trails, respected the park's dangers, and always followed the rules. David was meticulous about preparation. He carried maps, a compass, extra water, first aid supplies, and emergency blankets. He wasn't the kind of man who took unnecessary risks, especially not with his children. That morning, they'd planned to hike the Storm Point Trail, a well-marked 3-mile loop along Yellowstone Lake that the family had completed twice before. It was rated easy, suitable for children, and offered stunning views without venturing into dangerous territory. They told the couple staying in the cabin next to theirs about their plans, expected to be back by early afternoon, and set off around 9 in the morning with high spirits and full backpacks. But sometimes, the smallest decisions create the biggest consequences. About an hour into their hike, Jacob noticed something unusual. He'd stopped on the trail, staring into the dense forest to the north. "Dad," he said, his voice filled with that particular quality of childhood wonder that makes parents pause. "Look at those stones. They're in a pattern." David walked back to where his son stood. Through the trees, barely visible, was what appeared to be a series of stacked rocks, cairns, the kind that hikers sometimes build to mark unofficial paths. Sarah felt a flutter of unease in her stomach, though she couldn't have said why. Emma stood beside her mother, squinting into the shadows. The cairns led into the forest, away from the marked trail. David studied them for a long moment. He knew better than to follow unmarked paths in Yellowstone. The park covered over 2 million acres, much of it true wilderness where people could disappear forever. There were thermal features that could appear without warning, pools of boiling water hidden under innocent-looking ground. There were cliffs, rivers, and terrain that could turn lethal in minutes. "Someone probably just stacked them for fun," Sarah said, trying to guide the moment back to safety. "We should stick to the trail," but Jacob was insistent. "What if someone built them to show something cool? What if there's a waterfall or something? We could just look for a few minutes." David hesitated. This was the moment, Sarah would later realize, when everything changed. If he'd said no. If she'd been more forceful. If they'd simply continued on their planned route. But they didn't. "Tell you what," David said, making a decision that seemed reasonable in the moment. "We'll follow them for exactly 15 minutes. If we don't find anything interesting, we turn around immediately. We'll be careful, stay together, and if anything seems unsafe, we head straight back." Sarah wanted to argue, but she also didn't want to be the parent who always said no, who couldn't allow for spontaneity and adventure. Emma seemed excited by the prospect of exploring something new, and it was just 15 minutes. They left the marked trail. The forest swallowed them almost immediately. The cairns continued, appearing every 50 feet or so, leading them deeper into territory that grew increasingly rough. David checked his compass regularly, making mental notes of their direction. Northeast, then curving north, then northwest. The terrain sloped downward, growing rockier. Pine trees gave way to a mixture of spruce and deadfall from an old fire. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as they descended into a narrow valley. Emma stayed close to her mother, her earlier excitement fading into uncertainty. "How much longer?" she asked. David checked his watch. 5 more minutes, then we turn back." But then Jacob shouted ahead of them, "Look! Look at this!" They hurried forward to find him standing at the edge of a clearing. Beyond him, the land dropped away suddenly, revealing something none of them had expected: a canyon. Not one of Yellowstone's famous grand vistas, but something smaller, more hidden. The walls were perhaps 100 feet high, covered in vegetation, with a stream visible at the bottom, winding between rock formations and stands of trees. Morning light filtered down in golden shafts, and the whole scene had an otherworldly quality, as if they'd stumbled into a secret corner of the world that existed outside normal maps and human knowledge. "Wow," Emma breathed. David pulled out his map, studying it with a frown. "This isn't marked," he said slowly. "I mean, there are dozens of small canyons in the park, but this one, I don't see it on here." Sarah felt that flutter of unease again, stronger now. "Maybe we should take a few pictures and head back. We can report it to the rangers, let them know about the cairns." But Jacob was already moving along the rim, looking for a way down. "Can we go down there? Just for a minute? I want to see the stream up close." What happened next would be debated, analyzed, and agonized over for years. David found what appeared to be a safe path down, a natural slope with enough handholds and stable ground. He decided they could descend, spend 15 minutes exploring the canyon floor, then climb back up and return to the marked trail. They'd still be back at the cabin by early afternoon. It seemed like a reasonable extension of their small adventure. The descent took longer than expected. The path was steeper than it appeared from above, and they had to move carefully, helping Jacob and Emma navigate the trickier sections. By the time they reached the canyon floor, nearly 30 minutes had passed since leaving the marked trail. But the canyon was beautiful. The stream was crystal clear, running over smooth stones. Small fish darted in the shallows. Wildflowers grew in clusters along the banks. The walls rose around them, creating a sense of protected isolation. For a moment, Sarah's anxiety faded. They were all together. It was a gorgeous spot, and sometimes the best memories came from unplanned moments. Then everything went wrong. It started with a sound, a deep rumbling groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. David's head snapped up, his engineer's mind immediately recognizing danger. "Move!" he shouted. "Away from the walls!" Now. They ran toward the center of the canyon floor just as the first rocks began to fall. Later, geologists would explain that the area was prone to small rock slides, especially after the morning sun warmed certain unstable formations. But in that moment, there was no time for understanding, only terror. Stones rained down from the eastern wall, some as small as fists, others the size of cars. Dust filled the air. Sarah grabbed Emma, pulling her daughter close and covering her with her body. David had Jacob, shielding his son as debris crashed around them. The noise was deafening, like the world tearing itself apart. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Sarah raised her head, coughing in the dust-filled air. "Is everyone okay?" Her voice was hoarse with fear. Emma was crying but unharmed. David and Jacob emerged from their protective crouch, both shaken but without serious injury. They'd been incredibly lucky. The worst of the slide had missed them by 20 feet. But when the dust settled enough to see clearly, Sarah's blood turned to ice. The path they'd used to descend was gone, completely buried under tons of rock and earth. The entire section of the eastern wall had collapsed, creating an impassable barrier of unstable rubble that extended 50 feet up the canyon face. David stared at the destruction, his face pale. He was already scanning the walls, looking for another way out. There had to be another way. There was always another way. But as the hours passed and they explored every inch of the canyon within safe distance, the terrible truth became clear. The walls were too high and too sheer to climb, especially with children. The rockslide had blocked the only safe path they'd found down. The stream flowed out through a gap in the western wall, but it was too narrow and too deep to follow. Investigating it even briefly revealed it led into a tunnel through the rock, possibly for miles, definitely impassable. They were trapped. What should happen next in a situation like this? David had his cell phone, but there was no signal in the canyon. They had their backpack with sandwiches, water, a first aid kit, emergency blankets, Enough for a day hike, not for a crisis. They had whistles, which they blew repeatedly, the sharp sounds echoing off the canyon walls and disappearing into the vast wilderness above. Sarah held Emma close, trying to stay calm. "Someone will find us," she said, as much to convince herself as her daughter. "We told the neighbors about our hike. When we don't come back, they'll alert the rangers. There'll be a search." David nodded, but his expression was troubled. "The cairns led us off trail. We walked for probably 40 minutes before we found the canyon. Then we descended. We're miles from where anyone expects us to be." Night fell on the canyon. They huddled together under the emergency blankets, which David had fashioned into a crude shelter against the canyon wall. The temperature dropped dramatically. Emma and Jacob were frightened but trying to be brave. Sarah kept up a steady stream of reassurance. While inside, her mind spiraled through increasingly dark scenarios. David sat slightly apart, staring up at the strip of star-filled sky visible between the canyon walls. He was thinking like an engineer, trying to solve an impossible problem. Would help come? How long would it take? And even when searchers came looking, how would they ever find this hidden canyon? Ranger Michael Torres received the call at 6:15 in the evening on August 14th. A family of 4 had failed to return from a day hike. The couple in the neighboring cabin had waited until after the Hendersons' stated return time, then another 2 hours out of politeness, before finally contacting park authorities. By the time Torres and his team began mobilizing, the sun was already setting. Torres had been with Yellowstone's search and rescue operation for 11 years. He'd participated in dozens of searches, found lost hikers suffering from nothing worse than dehydration and embarrassment, and, on darker occasions, recovered bodies from people who'd underestimated the park's dangers. But he'd never lost someone completely. Every missing person case in his experience had ended with recovery, one way or another. This case would haunt him for the rest of his career. The initial search began that night with available personnel sweeping the Storm Point Trail and surrounding marked paths. They called the Henderson family's names, used spotlights to search the immediate area, and found nothing. No sign of the family, no indication they'd ever been there. By dawn on August 15th, the search had expanded dramatically. Additional rangers arrived from other sections of the park. Volunteers from local search and rescue organizations joined the effort. A helicopter with thermal imaging equipment began systematic sweeps of the area. The command center, set up in a parking area near Yellowstone Lake, became a hub of organized urgency. Sarah's parents arrived from California, her mother's face a mask of controlled panic. David's brother flew in from Chicago. The families provided photos, detailed descriptions, and every piece of information that might help. Emma was 12, about 5 feet tall, with long brown hair and brown eyes, last seen wearing a blue jacket and jeans. Jacob was 8, 4 feet tall, wearing a red shirt and khaki shorts. David, 6'1", athletic build, dark hair graying at the temples. Sarah, 5'6", blonde hair, wearing a green hiking jacket. The couple from the neighboring cabin confirmed the family had mentioned Storm Point Trail, but when searchers scoured every inch of that trail and expanded outward in careful grid patterns, they found nothing. No tracks, no discarded items, no disturbances in the vegetation. It was as if the Henderson family had simply ceased to exist the moment they entered the park that morning. "This doesn't make sense," Torres told his supervisor on day 3. "We've covered hundreds of acres. We've got helicopters, ground teams, dog units. 4 people don't just vanish, especially not with 2 children, but they had vanished. And with each passing day, the chances of finding them alive diminished. The park's public information office released the family's photos and information to media outlets. Local news covered the story extensively. National outlets picked it up. Sarah's parents made tearful appeals on television, begging anyone with information to come forward. The Hendersons' neighbors back in Seattle organized vigils. Emma's school held prayer services. The story captured public attention in the way that certain cases do: an ordinary family, a routine vacation, an incomprehensible disappearance. Tips flooded in. People claimed to have seen the family at various locations around the park, in nearby towns, even in other states. Every lead was investigated. Everyone led nowhere. In the canyon, David was trying to keep his family alive. Those first 72 hours were the worst. They had water from the stream, which David carefully boiled using methods he improvised from what they had. He'd always been interested in survival skills as a hobby, though he'd never imagined needing them. They rationed the food from their day pack: sandwiches, granola bars, an apple. It lasted 2 days. Jacob cried at night, asking when the rescuers would come. Emma tried to stay strong, but Sarah could see the fear in her daughter's eyes. Sarah herself oscillated between hope and despair, sometimes within the same minute. They blew their whistles for hours each day until their lips were cracked and bleeding. They created large SOS symbols on the canyon floor using rocks. They did everything they could to signal their presence, but the canyon was too deep, too isolated. Helicopter sounds occasionally echoed overhead, muffled by the canyon walls, but they never came directly overhead. The SOS was invisible from above, hidden by the overhang of the canyon rim and the vegetation growing on the upper walls. David started to understand that rescue might not come. Not in time. Maybe not at all. On the 4th day, he made a decision that would save their lives. Instead of waiting passively for rescue, they would have to survive actively. They would have to adapt. He began by exploring the canyon more thoroughly, always keeping his family in sight. The canyon was larger than they'd initially realized, perhaps a 1/4 mile long and winding in shape. There were several side areas, including one with a natural overhang that provided better shelter. The stream supported fish, small trout that could be caught with patience. There were edible plants, though David was careful to positively identify them before letting anyone eat. His childhood had included camping with his grandfather, a man who'd known wilderness survival. Those half-forgotten lessons became critical now. Sarah watched her husband transform. The comfortable engineer who solved problems with computers and blueprints became someone more primal, focused entirely on keeping his family alive. He taught Jacob how to catch fish using a hook fashioned from a sharp stone and line from the unraveled threads of his jacket. He showed Emma which plants were safe to eat. He built a better shelter using branches and their emergency blankets, creating something that could keep them dry and relatively warm. At the command center, Torres refused to give up. "We expand the search radius," he insisted on day 5. "They might have gone off trail." People do it, even careful people. Maybe they were following an animal or thought they saw something interesting. Teams pushed further from the Storm Point Trail, searching areas that seemed increasingly unlikely. They investigated every small canyon, every valley, every place a family might have gone. But Yellowstone was vast, and the hidden canyon where the Hendersons were trapped was too far off the expected paths, too concealed by its geography, too unknown even to rangers who'd worked the area for years. By day 8, the official search was suspended. Not called off entirely, the case would remain open, investigators would continue following leads, and rangers would stay alert for any signs during regular patrols. But the active, coordinated search with dozens of personnel and expensive helicopter hours couldn't continue indefinitely. Torres made the call to Sarah's parents himself. It was the hardest conversation of his career. "We haven't found them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've searched hundreds of square miles. We've used every resource available. But we haven't found any trace, and that means they could be anywhere. We're not giving up. We're just transitioning to a different phase." What he didn't say, what everyone understood, was that after 8 days in Yellowstone's wilderness without supplies, the chances of survival were virtually zero. The nights were cold. There were bears, wolves, and countless other dangers. Even experienced survivalists would struggle. A family with 2 young children? The assumption was that they'd died somewhere in the park, in a location so remote or so hidden that their remains might never be found. Yellowstone kept its secrets. The park had swallowed people before and never given them back. Sarah's mother collapsed when she heard the news. Her father stood with his hands over his face, shoulders shaking. David's brother punched a wall, bloodying his knuckles, unable to process the loss. Back in Seattle, their house stood empty. Emma's bedroom, with its posters and books, waited for a girl who would never return. Jacob's toy cars sat in neat rows where he'd left them. The life the Henderson family had built, the routines, the plans, the future they'd imagined, all of it ended on a sunny August morning when they made the simple decision to follow a line of stacked stones into the forest. Except they hadn't ended. Not yet. How did David Henderson keep his family alive in that canyon during those first crucial weeks? How did he find food, maintain hope, and prevent despair from destroying them all? 3 weeks into their ordeal, Sarah Henderson sat by the stream watching her husband teach their 8-year-old son how to make rope from plant fibers. The scene was so surreal, so completely disconnected from their normal life, that sometimes she felt like she was watching it happen to someone else. David's hands moved with confident precision as he demonstrated the twisting technique. "See, Jake? You take 3 strands, overlap them like this, and twist. The friction holds it together. It's not as strong as real rope, but it'll work for what we need." Jacob's tongue stuck out in concentration as he tried to mimic his father's movements. The boy had lost weight, they all had, but his eyes still held that spark of curiosity. He'd adapted to their situation with the surprising resilience of children, treating their survival activities as an extended camping trip rather than the life-or-death situation it truly was. Emma sat nearby, sorting through a collection of stones she'd gathered. David had taught her to identify different types, explaining which ones would work for various tools. She'd become skilled at selecting the right stone for the right purpose: sharp edges for cutting, smooth surfaces for grinding, dense rocks for hammering. Sarah's role had evolved into something she'd never imagined. She maintained their shelter, treated minor injuries with improvised remedies, kept track of their food stores, and most importantly, kept everyone's spirits from breaking. Some days, that last task felt impossible. The shelter David had built was remarkable. Using the natural overhang Sarah had noticed, he'd created walls from woven branches and packed them with mud and grass for insulation. The roof extended the overhang's protection, angled to channel rain away from their living space. Inside, beds made from pine boughs provided cushioning. A fire pit with carefully arranged stones created a cooking area with decent ventilation. He'd even engineered a system to collect and filter rainwater, knowing they couldn't rely solely on the stream. "I keep thinking someone will find us," Sarah said quietly, not directing the comment at anyone in particular. David looked up from his rope-making lesson. His face was thinner now, weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were still kind. "They're looking." "I know they're looking, but we can't wait for rescue. We have to survive until it comes, however long that takes. However long that takes. Days, weeks." The possibility that stretched before them, unspoken but ever present, was that rescue might never come. That they might spend years in this canyon, that they might die here. David had faced that possibility and made a decision. If they were going to be here long term, they needed more than survival. They needed sustainability. They needed a life, not just existence. The fish in the stream had become their primary protein source. David and Jacob had gotten remarkably good at catching them. They'd learned the fish's patterns, the best times to hunt, the most productive pools. They dried fish in the sun, creating stores for days when fishing was poor. The process was tedious but necessary. Edible plants supplemented their diet. David had been conservative at first, only eating plants he could positively identify. But desperation had made him more experimental. He'd test small amounts, wait for reactions, then cautiously add new foods to their diet. They found cattails by the stream. The roots were starchy and filling. There were wild onions in one section of the canyon, adding flavor to otherwise bland meals. Certain berries proved safe. The variety was limited, and they were all perpetually hungry, but they weren't starving. The hardest part was the uncertainty. Not knowing if anyone was still looking, not knowing if they'd been declared dead, not knowing if they'd ever see their extended family again or return to the lives they'd left behind. Sarah thought about her students back in Seattle. School would be starting soon, had already started probably. Another teacher would be standing in her classroom, working with kids who'd wonder what happened to Mrs. Henderson. Her parents would be grieving, probably planning some kind of memorial service. The thought of her mother's pain was almost unbearable. "Mom?" Emma's voice broke through Sarah's dark thoughts. "Can you help me with something?" Sarah moved to sit beside her daughter. Emma had been struggling the most with their situation, old enough to understand the gravity of their circumstances, but young enough to feel powerless. She'd grown quiet and withdrawn, especially in the evenings. "What do you need, sweetie?" Emma held up a piece of bark. "I want to write something, like a letter. I know we can't send it, but I want to write to my friends, tell them what happened. Is that weird? Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. No, honey, that's not weird at all. I think it's a beautiful idea. They spent the next hour using charcoal from the fire pit to write on pieces of bark. Emma wrote to her best friend Melissa, describing the canyon, their survival activities, how much she missed normal life. Sarah found herself writing to her own mother, words she knew would never be read but needed to be expressed anyway. David and Jacob joined them as evening fell. They all sat together by the fire, watching shadows dance on the canyon walls. Jacob had caught 3 fish that day and was proud enough to describe each catch in elaborate detail. David had found a deposit of clay that might be useful for making more durable containers. Emma shared a story about seeing a fox at the canyon's far end. These moments of almost normalcy were precious. They were still a family. They still loved each other. The canyon had taken everything else, but it hadn't taken that. As September turned into October, the weather grew colder. David became obsessed with preparing for winter. He'd done the math. They were at roughly 7,500 feet elevation. Yellowstone winters were brutal. Temperatures could drop below zero. Snow could pile several feet deep. The stream might freeze. We need more shelter, he told Sarah one evening after the children were asleep. What we have won't be enough. We need to insulate better, store more food, have more firewood than we could possibly imagine needing. David, Sarah kept her voice low. Do you really think we'll be here that long? He was quiet for a moment. I think we have to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. If rescue comes tomorrow, great. But if it doesn't... They worked through autumn preparing for winter. David found a small cave in the canyon wall, not large but deep enough to provide additional shelter. He created multiple wood stores, gathering every fallen branch they could find and stacking them in protected areas. They dried fish and edible roots, creating stores of preserved food. David fashioned warmer clothes by layering materials, using plant fibers and animal skins from small game he learned to trap. Jacob's 9th birthday came and went in October. They sang to him, gave him a fish they'd cooked specially, told stories. He cried that night, asking why rescuers hadn't found them yet, why they had to stay in the canyon. David held his son and promised that somehow, someday, they'd get home. Sarah watched Emma withdraw further. Her daughter spoke less, smiled rarely, spent hours sitting alone. Sarah tried everything to reach her, but 12 was a terrible age to be trapped, old enough to grieve for the normal life she'd lost, not yet old enough to fully understand or process the trauma. Then winter came, and everything got harder. The first snow fell in early November, light at first, then heavier. The canyon transformed into something both beautiful and terrifying. The walls became white cliffs. The stream slowed but didn't freeze entirely, thanks to some underground source that kept it flowing. Temperatures plummeted. They survived by staying in the insulated shelter, huddling together for warmth, only venturing out when absolutely necessary. David kept multiple fires burning, rotating between them to maximize heat. They burned through their wood stores faster than he'd hoped, forcing dangerous expeditions to gather more. Sarah developed a cough that lasted weeks. Emma's hands cracked and bled from the cold, despite David's attempts to create protective coverings. Jacob grew quieter, his usual energy suppressed by the relentless cold and confinement. There were moments when Sarah thought they wouldn't make it. Nights when the wind howled through the canyon and their fires guttered low, and she held her children close and prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening. Moments when the isolation and fear were so overwhelming that she wanted to simply give up. But she didn't. None of them did. David's engineering mind had made him a meticulous planner. Sarah's teaching experience had made her patient and nurturing. Emma's intelligence helped her adapt and learn. Jacob's optimism, even when strained, reminded them why they were fighting. They were surviving. Barely, desperately, but surviving. And then, on a February morning when the snow was finally melting and the first hints of spring were appearing in the canyon, something happened that would change everything. Jacob heard it first, a sound that didn't belong to the canyon, not wind or animals or the stream, something else. "Dad," he whispered, his eyes wide, "I hear something, someone crying." What had Jacob heard in the wilderness? Who else was out there in that remote corner of Yellowstone? David Henderson moved quietly through the snow, Jacob close behind him, following the sound that shouldn't exist. They'd been living in the canyon for 6 months. They knew every sound it made, every bird call, every rustle of wind, every crack of ice. This sound was different. This sound was human. The crying was faint, coming from somewhere beyond the western end of the canyon where the stream disappeared into the rock tunnel. David had explored that area before, but had been focused on the stream itself, on whether it could provide an escape route. He'd dismissed the surrounding terrain as too steep and dangerous to investigate thoroughly. Now, guided by the desperate sound of a child's sobs, he found something he'd missed, a narrow passage barely visible leading away from the main canyon. It was more of a crack in the rock than a proper path, but it was passable for someone determined or desperate enough. "Stay close," David whispered to Jacob, "and stay quiet." We don't know what we're walking into. The passage opened into a smaller canyon, really more of a box canyon, enclosed on 3 sides. And there, huddled against the far wall in the shadow of an overhanging rock, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her jacket was torn, her face was dirty and streaked with tears, and she was shaking violently from cold or fear, or both. When she saw David and Jacob, she tried to scramble away, pressing herself harder against the rock. "It's okay," David said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "We're not going to hurt you. My name is David. This is my son, Jacob. Are you hurt?" The girl stared at them with wide, terrified eyes. She didn't speak. David tried again, keeping his voice calm and gentle. "You're cold. We have a warm shelter and food. Will you come with us? We can help you." For a long moment the girl didn't move. Then, slowly, she nodded. David approached carefully, moving like he might around a frightened animal. When he got close enough, he could see she was in rough shape. Her lips were blue, her fingers were pale, possible frostbite. She'd been out here for hours, maybe longer. "Can you walk?" he asked. Another nod. "Okay. Jacob, stay with her. I'm going to get your mother." David ran back through the passage, his mind racing. Another child, lost in the wilderness. How? When? The same questions that must have been asked about his own family 6 months ago. He burst into the main canyon, calling for Sarah. She and Emma emerged from the shelter, alarmed by his tone. "There's a little girl," David said quickly. "Lost, hypothermic. We need to warm her up fast." Sarah's teacher instincts kicked in immediately. She started giving orders, and they fell into coordinated action. Emma stoked the fire to maximum heat. Sarah grabbed their warmest blankets. David led them back to the small canyon. The girl was still there, Jacob sitting beside her, talking softly. "My mom's a teacher," he was saying. "She's really nice. And my sister Emma is 12. She can show you her rock collection." Sarah's heart broke at the sight of the child. She knelt down, her voice taking on the warm, reassuring tone she'd used with countless frightened students over the years. "Hi, sweetie. I'm Sarah. Let's get you somewhere warm, okay?" The girl allowed herself to be led back to the shelter. They wrapped her in blankets, positioned her near the fire, and Sarah began the careful process of treating hypothermia, warming her gradually, checking for frostbite, offering warm water in small sips. As the girl thawed and the immediate crisis passed, she finally spoke. Her voice was small and hoarse. "My name is Lily." Lily Chen. Sarah exchanged glances with David. "Lily, how did you get here?" "Where are your parents?" Lily's eyes filled with tears again. "We were hiking. Me and my dad and my mom. I wanted to see a marmot. I saw one go behind some rocks and I followed it and I got lost. I couldn't find the trail. I called for them, but nobody came." The story was horrifyingly familiar. Another family, another moment of innocent curiosity leading to catastrophe. "When did this happen, Lily?" David asked gently. "I don't know. It was light, then dark, then light again, then dark again. I'm not sure. She'd been lost for at least 2 days, possibly more. And she'd survived through sheer luck, finding that sheltered spot in the small canyon, staying put like children are taught to do when lost." "Your parents are looking for you," Sarah said firmly. "There are rangers and search teams. They won't stop looking." Even as she said it, Sarah felt the bitter irony. Search teams were probably looking for Lily right now, just as they'd looked for the Hendersons 6 months ago. And they'd failed to find her just as they'd failed to find the Hendersons, because this corner of the park was somehow invisible to the outside world. Over the next few days, as Lily recovered physically, the full scope of the situation became clear. She'd been hiking with her parents in mid-February 2017. They'd been on a trail on the park's northern end when Lily wandered off. It had taken her parents several minutes to realize she was missing, and by then, she was already disoriented. Lily had walked for hours, growing more lost until she'd stumbled down into terrain that eventually led her to the small canyon where David and Jacob found her. She'd been there for 3 days, slowly freezing, waiting for rescue that never came. Now she was trapped in the same impossible situation as the Hendersons. Emma, who'd been withdrawn for months, found new purpose in caring for Lily. She showed the younger girl everything they'd learned about survival, how to fish, which plants to eat, how to stay warm. The responsibility seemed to pull Emma out of her depression. She became protective and nurturing, almost a second mother to Lily. Jacob was thrilled to have another child closer to his age. He taught Lily his favorite games, showed her his collection of interesting stones, and included her in his daily routines. David and Sarah now had 3 children to keep alive instead of 2. The added responsibility was daunting, but in a strange way, Lily's presence helped. She was proof that the outside world still existed, that people still hiked in Yellowstone, that the normal life they had left behind was continuing without them. It gave them hope that somehow, eventually, they'd find their way back to it. But Lily's arrival also raised troubling questions. If she'd gotten lost and ended up here, it meant this area was somehow more accessible than David had thought. There had to be routes in and out that they hadn't found yet, maybe even a way to reach the marked trails. David became obsessed with the idea. He spent hours exploring, mapping every inch of terrain he could safely reach. He climbed as high on the canyon walls as possible, looking for routes that might lead out. He followed the stream in both directions until it became impassable. And slowly, over weeks and months, he began to understand the geography of their prison. The main canyon was part of a complex network of small canyons, passages, and valleys, a hidden system carved by ancient water flows and geological shifts. Some passages led nowhere. Some were too dangerous to explore, but some went deeper into the wilderness, into areas that might eventually connect to more traveled parts of the park. It wasn't an escape route yet, but it was the beginning of understanding, and understanding was the first step toward freedom. As spring turned to summer, the Henderson family and Lily Chen settled into a new rhythm. They expanded their living area, creating separate sleeping spaces. They improved their food gathering and storage systems. David built better tools, more efficient shelters, and even a crude calendar system to track the days. Sarah homeschooled the children as best she could, using charcoal and bark to teach math, writing, and science. She told stories to preserve their connection to literature and imagination. She made sure they didn't forget how to read, how to think, how to be more than just survivors. Lily slowly opened up about her life before. Her parents lived in San Francisco. Her father was a doctor, her mother a software engineer. She was an only child. She loved drawing and had a cat named Whiskers. She cried for her parents most nights, and Sarah would hold her, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "They're looking for you," Sarah would say. "They haven't given up." Parents never give up. But as months turned into a year, then 2 years, Sarah began to wonder if that was true. At what point did searching turn into mourning? At what point did hope turn into acceptance? The family celebrated birthdays and holidays as best they could. Jacob turned 10, then 11. Emma became 13, then 14, her childhood slipping away in a wilderness prison. Lily turned 8, then 9, growing up among people who weren't her family but who loved her like she was. David's hair turned from gray-streaked to mostly gray. Sarah developed calluses on her hands and a permanent squint from sun exposure. They aged years in what felt like lifetimes, their old identities as suburban professionals fading into distant memories. But they survived. Through the second winter, which was somehow even harder than the first, through the scorching summer heat when the stream ran low and they had to ration water, through the day when Emma broke her arm falling from a rock face, and David had to set it with materials they'd scavenged, and Sarah had to be the one to hold her daughter down while Emma screamed. They survived through a flash flood that nearly destroyed their shelter, through a period when the fish disappeared from the stream and they went hungry for weeks, through the endless psychological weight of isolation and uncertainty. And they survived because they had each other, because David's methodical planning kept them fed and sheltered, because Sarah's emotional strength kept them from falling apart, because Emma and Jacob and Lily gave them reasons to keep going. By the summer of 2019, they'd been in the canyon for 3 years. David had expanded their living area to include multiple structures, a main shelter for sleeping, a separate area for food storage, a workspace where he crafted tools and maintained their equipment. He'd even built a crude shower system using diverted stream water and solar-heated stones. Their settlement had become almost comfortable. They had routines, systems, even small luxuries they'd figured out how to create. They could start fires easily now. They knew the seasonal patterns of the canyon, when fish were plentiful, when certain plants produced edible shoots, when to expect rain or snow. But comfort wasn't freedom, and every day Sarah felt pieces of their old lives slipping away. Emma was 15 now, growing into a young woman in circumstances no teenager should have to endure. She'd started her period in the canyon, a traumatic experience that Sarah had handled with improvised supplies and as much dignity as she could provide. Emma spoke often about the life she'd left behind, her friends, her school, her dreams of going to college and becoming a veterinarian. Those dreams seemed impossibly distant now. Jacob was 11 and barely remembered their house in Seattle. When he talked about home, he sometimes meant the canyon. That broke Sarah's heart more than anything else. And Lily, who'd spent more of her childhood in the wilderness than in civilization, sometimes seemed like a wild creature herself. Completely adapted to canyon life, skilled at survival, but losing touch with what it meant to be a little girl in the normal world. David knew they couldn't stay like this forever. The children needed more than survival. They needed education, socialization, medical care, and futures that extended beyond canyon walls. And he and Sarah, they were aging, wearing down. What would happen to the children if something happened to them? He'd been working on a plan. A desperate, dangerous plan, but a plan nonetheless. He'd discovered that the passage system Lily had stumbled through was more extensive than he'd initially realized. One route led several miles into the wilderness, eventually emerging on a ridgeline that David recognized from his original maps. He'd climbed to that ridgeline twice, both times finding himself looking out over territory that had to be within a few miles of established trails. But the route was treacherous. It involved climbing narrow passages, sections that would be dangerous even for an experienced adult, let alone children. And if they attempted it and failed, if someone got injured in the middle of that journey, they could die miles from their shelter with no way to get help. Sarah knew what David was thinking. They'd been married long enough to read each other's thoughts. "You want to try to get out?" she said one night after the children were asleep. "We can't stay here forever," David replied. "The kids are growing up. They're losing years they can't get back. And if something happens to us, if we try to leave and it goes wrong, we all die. If we stay, we die eventually anyway. Sarah, we've been here 3 years. 3 years. Maybe the search stopped. Maybe they declared us dead. Maybe no one's looking anymore." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. I know you're right. But the thought of putting the kids at risk, of making them climb through those passages. We train them. We prepare. We don't attempt it until everyone is ready. David took her hands. "We've survived this long. We can survive the journey out. And once we're out, once we reach a trail or a road or anywhere humans go, we can get home. We can actually go home." The word home hung between them, loaded with 3 years of longing. They began preparing. David made multiple trips through the passage system, mapping every dangerous section, identifying handholds and safe routes. He taught Emma and Jacob and Lily how to climb, how to navigate tight spaces, how to stay calm when heights made them dizzy with fear. Sarah created supply packs, dried food, water containers, first aid materials, everything they'd need for a multi-day journey. She drilled the children on emergency procedures, on what to do if they got separated, on how to signal for help. By September 2019, they were as ready as they'd ever be. The plan was to leave in early October, after the summer tourists had left the park, but before winter weather made the passages impassable. They would travel light and fast, aiming to cover the distance in 3 days, and emerge somewhere near the northern edge of the park where David believed they'd find established trails. But 2 days before their planned departure, something happened that changed everything. David was doing a final supply check when he heard it, a sound that made his blood freeze. A helicopter, much closer than usual, and it was slowing, circling, as if searching for something specific. He ran to the canyon floor, looking up through the narrow opening between the walls. The helicopter appeared overhead, so close he could see the markings: Yellowstone National Park, Search and Rescue. They were still looking. After 3 years, someone was still looking. David grabbed their signal mirror, the one item from their original supplies that he'd carefully preserved, and angled it toward the helicopter. Flash, flash, flash. The SOS pattern he'd learned as a Boy Scout decades ago. Emma and Sarah emerged from the shelter, their faces turned skyward. Jacob and Lily came running from the stream. They all stood together, a ragged group of survivors watching the helicopter circle. Did the pilot see them? The helicopter made another pass, lower this time. David flashed the mirror again and again, his arm aching with the effort. Sarah was jumping, waving her arms, screaming even though she knew they couldn't hear her over the rotor noise. And then the helicopter moved away, following the ridgeline, disappearing behind the canyon wall. They stood in silence, the sound of the rotors fading until the canyon was quiet again, except for the stream's constant murmur. "Did they see us?" Jacob asked, his voice small and desperate. David lowered the mirror, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know, buddy. I don't know." That night, hope and despair warred in their makeshift home. Maybe the helicopter would come back. Maybe searchers would follow up on something the pilot had seen. Maybe after 3 years, rescue was finally coming. Or maybe it had been their only chance, and they'd missed it. David and Sarah lay awake, holding each other, listening to the children's restless sleep. They had to make a decision, wait for rescue that might never come, or attempt their escape plan and take control of their own fate. "We wait 1 more week," David finally whispered. "If nothing happens, if no one comes, we leave on our own." "Deal?" "Deal," Sarah replied. But rescue didn't come that week, or the next, or the one after that. Fall deepened into winter, and the passages David had mapped became too dangerous to attempt. They'd missed their window. They were trapped for another year. How did the family endure that crushing disappointment, that return to hopelessness after coming so close to rescue? The winter of 2019 to 2020 slowly broke something in Sarah Henderson. She cared for the children, kept the fire, prepared meals, but the hope in her eyes faded. David tried jokes, games, promises of escape, but Sarah had heard it all before. Emma, now 15, took on more responsibility, her adolescence erased by survival. Jacob, 12, grew angry and withdrawn. And Lily, 10, had adapted almost too well, more at home in the wild than with people. David focused on what he could control, improving shelter, food storage, heating, and planning escape. By spring 2020, he had refined a route and even considered leaving alone to get help, but Sarah refused. "If you don't come back, we're lost forever." The argument left scars. Then Emma found the garden, a fertile patch of canyon soil where they began planting crops. For the first time, they weren't just surviving, they were building. Yet this raised new questions. Should they keep fighting to leave, or accept canyon life as permanent? By 2021, the children had become specialists. Emma learning leadership and engineering, Jacob excelling at hunting and tracking, Lily mastering medicine under Sarah's guidance. They were no longer just a family waiting for rescue, but a small society. Still, David planned another escape attempt for spring. Each year, though, they felt more adapted to the canyon and less connected to the outside world. Then, in October 2022, everything changed. Jacob, fishing upstream, heard voices. David led the family to investigate and came face to face with 2 strangers, Greg and Kyle Mitchell, lost hikers who had stumbled into the canyon. When David introduced himself, Greg froze. Henderson? The family that disappeared in 2016? You're supposed to be dead. They stopped searching years ago. The revelation crushed David's last fragile hope that anyone was still looking. But the Mitchells' presence meant something far more important. There was a way in, and maybe finally, a way out. Greg and Kyle Mitchell, lost hikers, stumbled into the hidden canyon where the Hendersons had survived for 6 years. Around the fire that night, David pressed them for a way out. The brothers admitted they'd marked a route, dangerous, narrow, and flooded in places, but it could lead back to the northern access road. Preparing for 2 days, the Hendersons packed light. Leaving the canyon felt like abandoning home, but Sarah reminded them it had never been life, only survival. The escape proved brutal, crawling through tight passages, wading waist-deep in icy water, inching along an 18-inch ledge with a 40-foot drop. When Lily froze in terror, Sarah calmly coached her across, step by step. Jacob nearly drowned, and exhaustion slowed them all, but they pressed on. At camp, David wavered. Was this worth the risk? But thoughts of Emma's stolen future, Jacob's lack of schooling, and Lily's grieving parents hardened his resolve. They had to finish. The next day, the terrain widened. By afternoon, sunlight broke overhead. They stumbled into Yellowstone's northern wilderness, mapped, known, and free. Emma and Sarah wept with relief. Even Lily cried. David stood apart, torn between grief for the years lost in the canyon and hope for the life ahead. That evening, they reached a road. A ranger, stunned, radioed in the impossible. The Henderson family and Lily Chen were alive after 6 years missing. As Sarah clutched the children and cried with relief, David knew they'd finally made it out. But freedom raised new questions. What kind of world awaited them, and how do you return to a life that no longer exists? The Henderson family's return sparked chaos. Within hours, Gardner's small hospital was swarmed by media, dubbing them the Yellowstone Miracle. Inside, doctors confirmed the impossible. A family had survived 6 years in a hidden canyon, raising their children and even sheltering a lost girl, Lily. Ranger Michael Torres, who'd led the 2016 search, broke down in tears. "We searched everywhere. How did we miss them?" Geologists later explained the truth. A hidden canyon system, a geological blind spot excluded from maps, accessible only by sheer luck. Reunions brought joy and pain. Sarah's aging parents wept, having buried empty caskets years before. David's family, equally stunned, welcomed them back. But their old lives were gone. Their house sold, finances closed, legal identities erased. Emma struggled to reconnect with her now-adult best friend. Jacob was overwhelmed by modern life, and Lily barely remembered her real parents. Trauma lingered. Sarah panicked in showers, David froze at restaurant menus, Emma slept on the floor, Jacob had nightmares, and Lily refused food she hadn't seen prepared. Doctors warned recovery would be slow. Meanwhile, the world had moved on. Pandemic, politics, culture shifts they'd missed. Tests showed the children were brilliant in survival skills but far behind in academics. They were, in every sense, time travelers. Settling temporarily at Sarah's parents' guest house, the family wrestled with freedom that felt strangely confining. Late at night, Sarah whispered to David, "Do you ever think about going back?" He admitted he did. The canyon had been prison and home, both. They had survived the impossible, yet as they lay awake listening to the hum of suburban life, one truth haunted them. They were free, but still felt lost. Within a week of their rescue, the Henderson story became a global sensation, dubbed the Yellowstone Miracle Family. News outlets worldwide covered it, and offers poured in from publishers and filmmakers. The attention, however, was overwhelming. Paparazzi camped outside their relatives' homes, Emma's old photos surfaced online, and strangers tried to insert themselves into their story. At their lawyer's advice, they agreed to one major interview. Journalist Maria Santos asked probing questions. David admitted his greatest pain was watching his children lose milestones because of his decision to leave the trail. Sarah spoke about the torment of hope. Emma mourned her lost adolescence. Jacob recalled hunger and fear. Lily shared her conflicted feelings about gaining one family while losing another. The interview aired to millions, sparking both admiration and criticism. Some accused them of endangerment or fabrication. The family struggled with reintegration. Emma resumed schooling online, Jacob had trouble adjusting to middle school, and both parents began therapy. Bureaucratic hurdles to restore their legal identities dragged on until early 2023. A book deal gave them stability and a home in Bozeman, Montana, close to Yellowstone, where they felt tied to their past. Lily lived mainly with her biological parents, but spent summers with the Hendersons, balancing two families. In May 2023, the family returned to the canyon for closure. They found their shelter weathered, their garden overgrown, and personal items still in place. Together they built a cairn as a memorial before leaving. "We're not the same people who lived here," David said. Life slowly rebuilt itself. David launched a consulting firm, Sarah returned to teaching, Emma enrolled at Montana State to study environmental science, and Jacob began helping with wilderness education. They spoke occasionally at conferences and safety programs, but mostly sought a quieter existence. The canyon years had cost them much, but they emerged with resilience, unbreakable bonds, and a hard-won new life, one that was not the life they had planned, but one they had made their own. In summer 2023, 7 years after entering the canyon, the Henderson family spoke at a national wilderness rescue conference in Denver. David shared lessons from 6 years of survival, not just about shelters and food, but about adaptability, purpose, and resilience. Sarah spoke of the mental battles, keeping hope alive against despair. Emma reflected on losing her teenage years but discovering inner strength. Jacob highlighted the closeness their ordeal had given them as a family. During Q&A, a ranger asked if they wished they'd stayed on the marked trail. David admitted they'd lost much, but said the experience forged who they were, inspiring Emma's studies and Jacob's passion for wilderness education. Sarah reminded the audience they also saved Lily, the young girl they found in the canyon. That night, they met Ranger Torres, who confessed guilt for calling off the search. David assured him he'd made the right choice, while Sarah noted the case had driven vital changes in rescue protocols. Indeed, their survival had reshaped national park procedures, inspired books, a documentary, and ongoing education programs. By 2025, the family had become advocates for wilderness safety and founded a support network for families of missing persons. They remained close to Lily, who now thrived with both families. On August 14, 2025, 9 years since entering the canyon, they gathered at Yellowstone for a memorial. A plaque honored their survival from 2016 to 2022. Looking over the wilderness, Emma spoke. "The canyon took 6 years from us, but it also gave us knowledge of our strength and bonds. We can be defined not by what happened, but by how we endured." As the sun set, they stood together, forever marked by the canyon, but no longer burdened by it. The true miracle wasn't just survival, it was surviving together and transforming loss into strength.